Nate had never been a man for stories. He'd spent over a decade in the Coast Guard, the kind of work that stripped superstition from a person. Storms didn't care about legends, nor did failing diesel engines or rusted hulls. To Nate, the sea was a matter of weather reports, barometric pressure, and steel maintenance. He wasn't the type to dramatize, but there was one story he told only when pressed, and only rarely. He told it reluctantly, as though every retelling chipped something away from him. His voice would lower near the end, as if the words themselves carried a weight that he hated to carry. It happened in the summer of 2017, when he and a fellow guardsman named Russell were sent to Matinus Rock, a barren tooth of stone nearly 40 miles off the Maine coast. The island wasn't a place meant for people. No trees, no soil, just jagged rock rising from the Atlantic, the spray forever dampening its surface. On that rock stood a single lighthouse, a white tower streaked with weather stains of green and black, its glass eye fixed on the restless horizon. Beside it crouched a squat auxiliary shed, a concrete box that stank of diesel and rust. Normally, lighthouse maintenance was a one-man job. Scrape the salt, refill the generator, test the beacon, record notes. But the year before, the light had failed twice, once for almost 12 hours, an unforgivable lapse on that stretch of rocky coast. This time, the order was to send 2 men, just in case. Nate and Russell came over by cutter, riding a swaying dinghy the last stretch to the rocks. The air smelled of brine and iron. The island's single landing platform was slick with moss, but they hauled their supplies up the narrow stairs and began the rotation. Days blurred quickly. Check the beacon's mechanics, inspect the backup batteries, top off the generator, scrub the metal fittings that the salt tried endlessly to consume. The sea groaned around them and gulls wheeled above, shrieking as though annoyed that men were intruding. At night, they ate from tin cans, read battered novels left by previous crews, and killed hours with cards. It was dull, yes, but safe. Until the 4th night. Nate woke suddenly, his eyes snapping open in the dark. His watch read just after 2. The air felt wrong, heavy, as though the atmosphere itself pressed against his skin. It reminded him of the charged silence before a storm. Yet when he glanced at the slit of window, the stars above the Black Sea were clear and sharp. Then he noticed it. The sweep of light from the beacon, the pulse that should have cut across their quarters every few seconds, was absent. Nate sat up, his heart ticking faster. The beacon was supposed to run at all times. A failure could cost lives at sea. He shook Russell awake, and together they climbed the spiral stairs, the iron groaning faintly under their boots. At the top, they found the gears still moving, the motor humming, but the light itself was jammed. Something dark and sodden was wedged deep in the mechanism. A blanket, or perhaps a coat. It was hard to tell. The cloth was waterlogged, slick with some mossy, slimy growth that clung to their gloves. Its smell was enough to make them gag. A choking stench of mildew and rotting seaweed, like something dragged from the seabed after years below. But the doors had been locked, the windows sealed. No gull or storm could have shoved this inside. The men said little. They pried it free, flung it into the sea, and tried to laugh it off. Still, sleep was slow in coming. The next night, just past 2 again, Nate woke. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. The room was dark, no sweeping beam. He felt the dread before he reached the stairwell. Russell was pale as they climbed together. The beacon was jammed again. But this time, it wasn't a blanket. It was a scarf, old-fashioned, frayed at the edges. Its fabric was a deep soaked red, dripping onto the floor as though freshly pulled from the ocean. Tiny crustaceans still clung to its fibers. Nate stared at it too long. The thought struck him absurd and terrifying. It looks worn, belonged to someone. The silence in the room was suffocating. They checked every hatch, every door. All were sealed tight. That night they shoved crates across the stairwell, a barrier of steel and wood, and locked the beacon room with trembling hands. By the 7th night, the island had grown hostile. Russell began talking in his sleep. Not words at first, just murmurs, whispers that raised the hairs on Nate's arms. One night, Nate woke to find him whispering into the corner of the room, his eyes half-lidded. "What are you saying?" Nate asked. Russell blinked, startled, then shook his head. "Wasn't talking," he mumbled and turned away. But later, Nate woke again to see him standing at the window, staring down at the black rocks where waves broke. "I saw someone," Russell whispered. "Last night, down there watching us." Nate's skin crawled. The following days brought no relief. Russell stopped sleeping altogether, stopped playing cards, stopped speaking except to mutter about noises in the walls or voices in the stairwell. He sat by the window, watching the rocks as though expecting something to climb them. On the 9th night, both men heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the beacon room above. The sound was unmistakable, leather on iron, step by step, patient, heavy. Nate froze. Across the room, Russell stood at the base of the stairs, his face bloodless. "You went up there?" Nate asked. Russell shook his head. His lips trembled. "Did you?" Neither had moved. But still, the footsteps came, until they didn't. They ended suddenly, cut off mid-step. The silence afterward was worse, like the whole tower was holding its breath. That night, they dragged a dresser against their bedroom door and slept with knives in reach. The 11th night broke them. Again, the light failed. Again, they climbed the stairs. But this time, the beacon room door was wide open, swinging in the wind. The bulb, a massive industrial thing, had been unscrewed, lifted from its socket, and placed carefully upright in the center of the floor. No storm could have done that. Nate's skin crawled with cold. Behind him, Russell whispered, "Someone's here. Someone did this." Then something brushed Nate's back. Something cold, like wet skin. He spun, knife ready, but nothing stood there. Russell's face drained of blood. His eyes locked on the far wall. "A hand," he whispered. "It came out of the bricks." Nate grabbed him and they fled, slamming the door, racing down the spiral stairs 2 at a time. They barricaded themselves in their quarters, Russell rocking in the corner, whispering to someone invisible. Nate sat awake all night, blade in hand, pulse hammering. At dawn, Nate had enough. He used the emergency sat phone, calling for early pickup under the excuse of mechanical failure. The relief boat agreed to come by afternoon. But when it arrived, the crew asked a question that chilled Nate's blood. "What happened after your call this morning, around 2 a.m.? Sounded urgent." Nate shook his head. He hadn't touched the sat phone until sunrise, but the crew insisted. They had received a garbled transmission at 2:12 a.m. static, then a voice, faint, but clear enough. "They're here, with us." Then the call had cut out. Russell didn't speak the whole ride back. He resigned from the Coast Guard within months, disappearing into civilian life. Nate still took assignments, but never again to Matinus Rock. When asked why, his only answer was, "Because sometimes the sea wants the dark back." Gregory told me about Ian one late night, his voice low and reluctant, the kind of tone people use when they half believe a story themselves. Ian had been his friend years ago, before the man disappeared from his own life. Gregory swore the story was true, or at least that Ian believed it was. Ian had been obsessed with abandoned places, old factories, forgotten bunkers, half-burned houses. He said the silence in such places was different, thicker, like the walls remembered the lives that had been there. When he heard about a decommissioned lighthouse in Washington state, set on a fog-drenched cliff miles from the nearest town, he had to see it for himself. The trip was reckless. The tower had been sealed decades ago, rust locking the doors, windows shattered by storms. Locals avoided it, muttering about accidents, drownings, things seen in the lantern glass. But Ian loved that kind of lore. One autumn afternoon, he scaled the fence, pushed open the warped service door and stepped inside. The air was sour with mold and sea rot. The narrow spiral stairs groaned under his boots. The lantern room above was missing panes, letting the wind moan through. It was perfect. He set up camp at the base, pulling out a lantern and his notebook. He planned to spend the night, jotting sounds, sketching details, recording what it felt like to live inside a place made only for light. But almost as soon as dusk fell, the lighthouse shifted. At first it was little things. A faint creak on the stairs when he wasn't moving, the groan of a door that wasn't there, the wet slap of something falling on stone. He wrote them down dutifully, grinning at his own nerves. Then came the footsteps. Not the faint echoes of wood settling, but solid, heavy steps circling above. He froze, pen mid-scratch. They moved in a slow arc around the lantern room, stopping directly overhead. The boards flexed as though bearing weight. "I'm not alone," he whispered into his recorder. He called out. No answer, just the wind sighing through broken glass. He climbed halfway up the stairs, lantern held high. The room above was empty, moonlight spilling across cracked glass. But in the dust on the floor, fresh prints led from one window to another. Barefoot prints. The arches were deep, the toes splayed, as though whoever left them had been standing in water. Ian backed down, heart thundering. He locked himself in the keeper's room, barricading the door with rusted tools. All night he heard pacing above, the slow, deliberate rhythm of bare feet on wood. Toward dawn, the noises stopped. Ian dared to breathe again. He convinced himself it had been nerves, echoes, the sea playing tricks. He packed quickly, but when he turned to leave, something caught his eye. In the corner of the room was a wooden box he swore hadn't been there before. Warped, swollen with damp. He knelt, lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of fabric, rotting scarves, faded coats, all salt-stiff and torn. And beneath them, pressed against the wood, a single human jawbone. He dropped the box, bile rising in his throat. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot through the hollow tower. And from above, he heard the footsteps again, only faster this time, rushing toward the stairs. He ran. Gregory said Ian never told the rest, only that he made it out somehow, sprinting until the tower was a speck behind him. He never went back, and he stopped exploring altogether. Within a year, he left town. No one heard from him again. Sometimes Gregory dreams of that lighthouse, though he's never seen it. He wakes with the sound of wet footsteps circling above him, and the smell of salt thick in his lungs. It was April of 2020, the peak of lockdown. The world felt emptied out, streets hushed, cities muffled. I hadn't seen another face for weeks, and when Soph finally agreed to meet me, it felt like a reprieve. She wasn't exactly my girlfriend. We'd been circling each other for months. But she was the closest thing I had to company, and I would have driven twice the distance if she'd asked. We met at the Montauk Lighthouse, where the island juts sharp into the Atlantic. On any other weekend, the parking lot would have been packed, but that night, there were no cars but ours. The lighthouse towered above us, black against the stars, its beams sweeping slow and indifferent across the sea. "Creepy, isn't it?" Soph said, smirking as if to cover her own nerves. I laughed, though my eyes lingered on the empty railings, the silent gift shop, the deserted walkways. It felt like trespassing in a ghost town. We hiked the narrow path behind the lighthouse, the one that hugged the cliff edge. The air was sharp with salt, and the only sound was the crash of waves far below. We walked side by side, our flashlights sweeping across scrub grass and jagged stone. Every so often, a piece of the path would crumble underfoot, sending tiny rocks skittering into the abyss. We kept close to the inner side, joking to mask the nerves. At first, I thought the noise behind us was just the echo of our own footsteps, but when we stopped, it didn't. Someone was pacing behind us, slow, measured, keeping distance but never falling away. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Soph nodded, her hand gripping my arm. We turned our lights back. The path was empty, just the pale beam of the lighthouse sweeping across rocks and brush. But when we turned forward again, the footsteps started once more, deliberate as a metronome. We moved faster. Soph's flashlight wobbled wildly, catching glimpses of something at the edge of the path. Shapes low to the ground, crouched, maybe 3 or 4 of them, unmoving until the light swept past. When I swung my beam back, nothing was there. We reached a fork where the path widened into a flat stretch of stone. My heart was hammering, my mouth dry. That's when Soph froze, pointing ahead. A man stood there, maybe 30 feet away. His posture was slack, head tilted as though his neck had given out. He wore a hood, but I could feel his eyes on us. Behind us, the footsteps resumed. We were boxed in. Soph hissed, "Go to the car, now!" We bolted, brushing past low branches, our lights bouncing off stone. I dared a glance back. The man hadn't moved. But farther back, 3 more figures had appeared, spaced evenly along the trail, just standing as if waiting. We reached the parking lot, gasping. My car was the only one there. The figures had stopped at the edge of the cliff walk, their silhouettes rigid against the night sky. They didn't follow into the open lot. They only stood, watching. I fumbled my keys. Soph shoved me toward the driver's side. "Hurry!" The engine caught. My headlights spilled across the figures. For a fraction of a second, I swore I saw faces, eyes too wide, mouths slack with something like hunger. Then the light swept past and they were shadows again. We drove off fast, the beam of the lighthouse receding in the rear view until it was just another star in the dark. I never went back to Montauk at night.